We're very happy and honored to have Isaac Bess with us here today. Thank you so much for joining us. And I hope you'll be able to do us a huge favor. You know, we want to hand things off to you. We've been talking way too much. So maybe for the next 5 minutes, tell us more about yourself, like describe your overall experience, what motivated you to take the program, and how have you been able to apply what you've learned from the program to your work?
Sure
Take
thing.
it away.
Yeah, thank you. And I love the sound of my own voice, so I'm happy to talk all about myself for as long as you're willing to hear it. My name is Isaac. I grew up in New York and Tokyo, and I went to college many decades ago now, and I emerged from college with a plan to become an academic and study history. But that plan went off the rails very quickly when I started working for a record company in New York right after college. And what ensued was many years of working in the music business. So I worked for record labels. I got involved in the early days of digital music when iTunes launched in 2003. I was based at the time in San Francisco, and I spent much of the first 10 years of the 2000s working on the earliest partnerships in the digital music space. So first ever Spotify partnership, first ever Amazon Music partnership, and so on and so on. And while doing that, I also, one of the partnerships I worked on was a very early version of what is now a sort of templatized partnership for YouTube, for music on YouTube. And I got to know the YouTube music team quite well. At the time in 2010 or 2009, 2010, YouTube was a very different thing than it is now. And in fact, there wasn't the sort of like the company structure, let's say, but even the content on YouTube looked decidedly different than it does now. And so I ended up getting recruited by YouTube, and I started working there in 2011. And I spent the first 4 years working on music licensing, and then I moved into what's called a product partnerships role, which is sort of like a catch-all business development role. At the time, we were contemplating the launch of what's now called YouTube Premium, and so we identified that there was this category of partnerships that would be needed for a successful subscription product. And so I was charged with doing them. And I'll say that, like, at every stage in my career, I had this plan that I should probably get an MBA. And mostly it took this form of sort of like ambiguous anxiety, where I was like, I'm just not super happy. You know, I was 25. I was like, I'm just not super happy in this job, so I should get an MBA. And then I got a different job, and I was like, all right, well, I'll put it on hold for a while. And I kept doing that, and I kept doing that. And then in 2016 or thereabouts, I had been working at YouTube for some time. And yeah, I think probably most of you know, working for Google is pretty nice, right? Like a good compensation, certainly relative to working for record labels. My compensation was really good. Google stock price is solid gold. And so on the face of things, everything looked like it was as it should have been. And yet I felt this like persistent feeling of like, not uncertainty so much as like a feeling that I needed to do something in my career that I wasn't currently doing. I was smart, I was successful, but I wasn't sort of like progressing in the way that I felt like I wanted to. And at big companies in particular, that sort of like plateauing or like slowed growth can be really disempowering, right? It can make you feel very much like, oh, well, maybe I was working for like the coolest company in the world. It's like, oh, maybe this is just what I'm going to be a middle manager at like Google for the rest of my life. And so I had this colleague who quit to go do the full-time MBA at UCLA. And I really liked him a lot. And I was checking in with him, and he was like, oh, you should check out UCLA. I didn't apply to any of the programs. I found this one program, and it was really the right one for me. And so I quit my job working at YouTube, and I went and did it. And so I started snooping around, and I found out about the UCLA-NUS program. And I had spent a lot of my career and my childhood going back and forth between the US and Asia. And so I felt very comfortable with that. And the way it was pitched to me, it was a slightly different pitch in 2016 than it is now. The way it was pitched to me was like, you're a busy guy working for YouTube. Why don't you come to Singapore for 2 weeks and hang out, and we'll teach you some stuff, and then we'll give you 2 degrees at the end of this cycle. And of course, like, it was more complicated and quite a bit more work than that. But and we can talk about it in more detail, but like the sort of short summary is that it had this transformative effect on my career, whereby I immediately quit working at YouTube and went to go work for this company that would become TikTok. And I was one of the first international employees of ByteDance prior to TikTok launching, which over the course of the last 5 years has proved to be one of the best professional decisions I ever made. And I definitely would not have made that decision. You can imagine I had to convince my wife that it was a good idea to quit working at Google to go work for some random Chinese company no one had ever heard of. And again, it was like certainly the smartest thing I ever did. And a lot of it is attributable to specifically just looking at the agenda for the academic adventure you're all about to embark upon. It was specifically due to the leadership class that I took in Singapore the first week, where we were running around the building, and I felt so completely transformed on my perspective in the world. And I think so frequently for all of us, it's easy to feel like, especially when you're in a privileged place, in a place that's not it's not torturous, to feel like, oh, well, maybe this is just where I should be. And part of what this program really taught me was like that I was capable of doing quite a bit more. And so I went from being a very low or mid-level manager at Google to running a very large part of TikTok. Now, a short 5 years later, and again, like almost entirely attributable to this experience that I had in this specific program. Now that said, like so it's just you should all go get MBAs, right? And most of you should probably get this specific MBA or these specific 2 MBAs, because it's a really smart thing to do. And it's hard to pay for, and it's not fun or whatever, but by all, the statistics bear out, right? Like it's a good investment. It will work out well for you. The only people that I knew for whom this program didn't do the thing that they wanted to do were people who wanted to make a hard pivot. So I had one specific person who was like, I'm in sales and I want to become a marketing person. And in this program, everything is hyper compressed. So you actually can't learn enough about marketing as a 35-year-old in like 6 days to make a hard pivot into like, a marketing role. There's other things you can do to sort of scratch that specific career itch. But for everybody else in my cohort, at least, it was truly like this transformative thing. So the practicalities of doing this, sorry, I'm probably going over time now, but like the practicalities of what you learn are, I don't want to say they're secondary, because they're not. They're actually really important. But the intention is not, especially to get this level of like advanced degree when you're mid-career as opposed to like when you're 27. The intention is not to become great at accounting or great at statistics or any of that kind of stuff, because in 3 days, you're not going to learn it. Like I learned accounting in 3 days. It was torturous. It was terrible. I don't recommend it except for you. You should all do it, because it's the right way to squeeze enough accounting into your brain so that anybody for the rest of your career can say like, here's this accounting, you should take a look at it, and you can read it and understand it, right? You're not going to become an accounting professor, but you can look at it. And it really empowers you to become a true leader. Because that's what leaders have to be able to do, is say like, oh, here's this, you're not a marketing person, but here's this marketing report. I can do that now, right? I can look at statistics and understand what it is. You don't want me as your statistics tutor, but I can understand all of it. So that was the impetus for me in this role, and taking this sort of like wild leap of faith. And I can't say enough positive things about it. So I'll pause there after that breathless self-introduction.
Thank you so much, Isaac. Thank you. So correct me if I'm wrong. Were you already with TikTok when you joined the program?
No, I was literally like, so I was working at YouTube. I was like, oh, I'm so tired of working at the greatest company in the whole world. I flew to Singapore. I was embroiled. I did this leadership class in 3 days, which was amazing. I started the marketing segment. And I've been talking to ByteDance about, this is pre-TikTok launch. I've been talking to ByteDance about this role. And they were like, hey, you're in the neighborhood. Why don't you come to Beijing? And I was like, okay, sure. And then of course, like Beijing and Singapore are not at all in the same neighborhood. So it's like this like quite tumultuous thing to get from one to the other and back again. So it was literally in the first segment that I had such an incredible experience already, especially being around like a cohort of other smart people, but whose background was decidedly different than mine. I'd spent most of my career in the music business, and so I was used to talking music business stuff. And then I was meeting this guy from Malaysia who was in the oil business, and a guy from India who was in the like concrete business, and all like completely very smart, completely different skill sets, completely different set of experiences. And so I was like, oh, I got to quit. I got to take this job. And I remember like at the end of my first segment in Singapore, we had this group session where I was like, should I do it? And I asked my 40 cohort members, like, should I do it or not? And they were like, do it. And I did it. And it was one of the best things I've ever done.
Wow, wow, okay. Yeah, because I reckon one of the most common concerns for a lot of prospects would be um, they could be, thinking about changing and switching their jobs, but to have that conversation with, their future employer about, the fact that they will be, flying to different countries every quarter to do this particular program. So, maybe do you have like any tips perhaps to share with prospects?
Yeah, I mean, I positioned it to my first employer and then again to my second because I was deep in. I mean, my first year at TikTok, I was still taking accounting and stuff like that. So I was very, and I also had like two young children. So like there was a lot of multitasking, and I have a very generous wife too, which is important actually. Like you should all take stock of your personal life also as you consider. There's never like a perfect moment to like go back to school or to have a kid or get married. Like there's always going to be something. So you can make a million excuses of like why not to do something, but like you should be aware that like it's a bunch of for 15 months it's gonna be a bunch of extra stuff that you're not currently doing. So like you will watch less Netflix or go to the gym less or drink less or whatever. Um, uh, yeah. So like I think being cognizant of like your family situation is really critical to making the decision, but you should do it anyway for sure.
Okay, and how would you typically prepare for each segment? Because there will be some pre-segment preparation. So, take us through your journey and then and tell us, tell the prospects that are here with us today what happens during the segment.
Sure. Yeah. So the work that's required in advance of the segment is not insignificant, but it's not so significant as to be like terrible, right? It's not, again, like, I mean, you've all been to undergrad, right? So it's like, there are some topics that are just naturally more interesting to you. So when I was like slogging my way through accounting pre-reads, that was not super fun for me, but also it was achievable. And you are all probably much like I'm sure you all were A students as undergrads. I was not. I was not, and so I had to 20 plus years after graduating with the bachelor's, I had to like relearn how to like not fail classes, which took some discipline. But it's actually I ended up being like a really good exercise for me in sort of ruthless prioritization. I think one often feels in your career and in your personal life that like other.
Oh dear, I think we are experiencing a technical glitch.
Was that I actually was able to have a job, to have two babies, to have a wife who didn't murder me, and also to not fail out of this program. So it's all achievable. So the sort of the work in between segments, you can be more disciplined to me and spread it out effectively over the time, or you can cram it into the last moment. But like it is real, but it's not so torturous as to be like a reason to not do it. I will mention, like I had to do some makeup classes because I would have, like I missed half of a segment because I had to do a business trip or whatever. And so I took, interestingly, I took classes with both NUS core, like executive MBA students and also UCLA core MBA students, like folks who just like take accounting on Thursday nights for like 6 months. It's a very different experience. And I think much more arduous, to be honest. Like I had a much harder time in those classes than I did in the sort of hyper intense 3 days. Like you're going to learn accounting in 3 days. That's it. The ones where it was like months and months and months of driving at UCLA or going to Singapore over and over again. That was more challenging for me. So that work is not insignificant, but it's not too terrible. The work in the segment itself is appropriately frenzied, let's say, because you're trying to cram a lot into a very small number of days. That said, the environment is intentionally fun, right? So like you will have time to, first of all, you're going to be away from your spouses and your families, right? So like, don't bring your kids to Shanghai for the Shanghai segment, right? Like just be dedicated to like learning accounting in Shanghai. Like take your kids to Shanghai some other time. So it's intense, right? And it's like, all morning and all afternoon. And then there's work to do in the evening, and then there's time to spend with your cohort and with your classmates, and your professors too, who are certainly there with you, right? So in many cases, the professors travel with you to China, to India. There's UCLA professors who come to Singapore. There's Singapore professors who come to UCLA. So like they're all there they have made the same commitment. Like these 2 weeks are just for spending time with each other, and I found that to be obviously, like, you don't love everybody in the same amount amongst 40 people, but it was a bunch of really smart, really interesting people with whom I still have a very active relationship.
Awesome. Just a couple more questions before we open it up to the floor. Feel free to type it in if you're a little bit shy, or you can always raise your hand in a bit and, turn on your mic. So Isaac, if you could name one thing, what was the most valuable or, most memorable takeaway from this entire experience for you?
I think most profoundly, it was understanding my own capacity. So without wanting to be immodest, right? Which is it's weird to talk about yourself in this way, right? So like if we were all just hanging out, I wouldn't say this, but but to understand, after having a professional career of more than 20 years, to then have a change in my own perspective on myself was quite profound. And like, I'm sure most of you know what TikTok is, right? So like 5 years ago when I started, it didn't exist, and now it exists, and now it's a big deal in lots of different ways, positive and negative. And I had a big hand in that, and that feels pretty great. And I honestly don't think that I would have had the mindset or the capacity, not only to make this leap, but also to be successful as I have been at TikTok. And so I have a new boss who I just met with yesterday for the first time, and our new COO. And I was thinking, we had this great meeting, and I was thinking, and just reflecting on all of it, and thinking like 5 years ago, I would not have been able to do what I did, right? And I wouldn't have been able to have the conversation with my new boss about what we've done and what we're going to do, and all the transformative things that we're going to do in the company, had I not gone through this. And again, it's not because like I had a great class in corporate finance, right? I did have a very good class in corporate finance, and I'm glad that I have that under my belt, but it's not because I learned a specific thing about corporate finance that let me talk to the new TikTok COO in the way that I want to talk to them. It's that the whole thing cumulatively changed my outlook on myself. And I think, to be honest, hopefully it's not too much candor for the UCLA and US folks, but I think that when people get MBAs when they're 26, right, they're saying like, I want to create like another stepping stone towards some like calculated advancement in my career, right? But because they're young, they're 26 or whatever, they're like, oh, I got decades to figure all this out, right? So I'm just going to have this feather in my cap, or this bullet in my LinkedIn profile. I'm going to have this thing that's going to help me to do a thing that I don't know yet what I want to do. And I think when people are in their 30s and their 40s, it's much more, like a feeling of professional dissatisfaction, right? Like I can't quite, like I said, like I was working for Google, right? It was pretty good, and I don't quite know what I want to do about it. Like I don't know quite why I'm not happy, and I don't quite know what I want to do, but I know I got to do something. And so it's almost like seeing a therapist, right? So like I found this program to be very much like seeing a career therapist who said like, help me to shape a bunch of things and help me to form decisions that got me to a place that's completely different from where I was before. And I think that's the thing that was most important for me. And everyone's different, but like for me, that was the thing that was most important. So I got some cumulative career therapy that completely changed my life.
Okay, one more question from me. Any useful tips or advice for future applicants? Like just imagine talking to Isaac, from 2016.
Sure. Yeah, like I said at the outset, if you have a spouse, talk with them about it, right? And set those expectations. I got a lot of duty-free gifts at the Singapore airport for my wife and children, but that's probably not enough, right? And I will continue to be grateful and paying it back to my wife for decades to come, I'm sure. I think that's really critical. And also, obviously, like I quit working at my job like within the first 6 months of being in this program. So like, that said, like I was very candid with my employer about my intention. And for Google has like a mechanism, you know, it's been around for a long time. So there was a mechanism for me to say like, hey, I'm going to do this thing. And it was like leave time that I had to add into my existing vacation. But it was pretty painless. At ByteDance, where again, we had 20 people who were not in China who were employed by the company. It took a little more work, but I think my candor with my manager and with HR was really important. But I think I don't think I have any practical regrets, but the one thing that was hardest for me was when I wasn't really able to disconnect from my work. And I remember being in Shanghai in particular, or maybe it was Shenzhen, but like really feeling like underwater because I had real academic pressure and also real work pressure. And I think had I been more forceful, YouTube didn't go out of business, right? So like my inability to execute while I was learning about, corporate governance in Shenzhen didn't impact the company. And so with the benefit of hindsight, I would have said like, hey, listen, YouTube boss, I'm just not going to be online for the next 2 weeks, or I'm going to be online twice in the next 2 weeks, but I can't actually deliver anything. That would be my sort of most overarching advice is like set expectations across the board in your life about what you can and can't be able to do. And if you do that, I think you'll have a lot more fun because you'll be able to, in addition to like take more away from the experience, you'll also be comfortable going out and having a beer after, on a Thursday night after a very long class. But important that you set those expectations.
Thank you. Thank you so much for sharing. That was really insightful, really fascinating as well.